Welcome to Daniel's Inferno. My name is Daniel. Thank you for joining me today. Today's video we have two topics for you. Before we get into those, if you have a moment, please like, subscribe, share, leave a comment below, and join the conversation. So, our topics for today. Firstly, the U.S. continues its defense of freedom and democracy by defending the Hong Kong protests, and China lashes out. As you can see here, China is suspending U.S. Navy visits to Hong Kong over a law being passed in the U.S. China said Monday it will suspend U.S. military ship and aircraft visits to Hong Kong and sanction several American pro-democracy and human rights groups, of course they will, in retaliation for the signing into law of legislation supporting anti-government protests in the semi-autonomous territory. The nature of the sanctions remain unclear. The move followed Chinese warnings that the U.S. would bear the cost if the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act was approved. They are in response to America's unreasonable behavior, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Huai Chuing said in Beijing, adding that the legislation seriously interfered in China's internal affairs. The law signed last Wednesday by Trump mandates sanction on Chinese and Hong Kong officials who carry out human rights abuses and require annual review of the favorable trade status that Washington grants Hong Kong. There's nothing unreasonable about this. Trump is supporting the freedom and democracy of the people of Hong Kong, and he is saying we are going to sanction people who are continuing and who commit human rights abuses. Well, I don't see anything really that unreasonable about that. I'm not sure if anyone agrees or disagrees, but for me, it seems very reasonable. You know, there's something in the West called the R2P, the responsibility to protect. And it's a very vague term, but it refers to how Western societies and democracies, it is incumbent on us to defend others around the world and to defend the rights and freedoms of those others. Now, how we apply that R2P is very, very vague, and that's where the problem comes in. However, as Western nations, who, of course there are issues, but we are doing fairly well in comparison to many other countries if you compare the West to other countries that are not adopting Western values. I don't think there's anything wrong, at least, of having a base standard of expectation with people we do trade with. And if they break this expectation or they go below this standard, then punishment happens. The legislation was backed by U.S. lawmakers who are sympathetic to the protesters and have criticized Hong Kong police for cracking down on the pro-democracy movement. Police say their use of tear gas, rubber bullets, and other force is a necessary response to escalating violence by the protesters who have blocked major roads and thrown gasoline bombs back at officers in riot gear. Hong Kong has been living in almost non-stop protests for 6 months. The movement's demands include democratic elections and an investigation into the police response. More fundamentally, the protesters and others in Hong Kong fear that China is eroding the rights and freedoms they have under a one country, two systems framework. The Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said China would sanction organizations including the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institution for Internal Affairs, Human Rights Watch, the International Republican Institute, Freedom House, and others that she said had performed badly in the Hong Kong unrest. China urges the United States to correct its mistakes and stop any words and deeds that interfere in Hong Kong and China's internal affairs, she said, adding that China could take further necessary actions depending on how matters develop. China has long accused foreign groups and governments of fomenting the demonstrators in Hong Kong, signaling out the U.S., former colonial overlord Britain, and democratic self-governing Taiwan, which China claims as its own territory to be annexed by force if necessary. Now, it's ironic that Taiwan is mentioned here, because the U.S. Navy was invited, quote, to go to Taiwan and, quote, have fun after China bans the port visits to Hong Kong. This is a big FU to China from Taiwan. There have long been tensions between the two. Excuse me for a moment. And this is, it's very funny. It's not funny because it escalates the tensions. It's funny because of how trolly and meme lordish it is. So, the decision to suspend the military ports calls in Hong Kong has been greeted with a degree of derision in Taiwan, with many suggesting that the Americans would be welcome to come to the island instead. Although the U.S. is unlikely to risk angering Beijing further by sending warships on a port call to the self-ruled island, many Taiwanese internet users said the southern port of Kaohsiung would win big if the Americans did decide to visit. One comment on the terminal bulletin board system joked that those visits would happen only when U.S.-China trade talks fall apart or reach a standstill. A Taiwanese blogger wrote on Facebook that such a move could stimulate spending in the port by U.S. naval officers and elevate the skills in naval vessel repairs. A former visiting fellow at the Global Taiwan Institute, Chang Fang Yu, joked to more than 19,000 followers on Facebook that the military could come to Taiwan to have fun. See, as I said, this is all very meme lordish, it's all very trolly, but it shows the escalation in the Asian peninsula that is being caused by the Hong Kong protests. And as I said, Taiwan and China have long had long-standing tensions. And I do think it would be very silly of the U.S. to do this move. Now, this is obviously depending on what their stance is. Trump said recently that perhaps a U.S.-China trade deal should wait until after the 2020 elections. Part of that, I'm sure, is so that whoever is the president can make the right decisions, and secondly, so we can see what the mandate of the people is. But as I said, this is all escalations in the tensions. So, as I said, please let me know what you think about all of this stuff with Hong Kong, with China, with Taiwan. Just, what's your opinion? I'd love to know. So, on a bit of a more serious note, a bunch of graves were vandalized in France, and unfortunately they were Jewish graves. So, anti-Semitism in France is on the rise. This is not something new. It is something that has been happening for the last few years. It's been a rising phenomena, and it's absolutely disgusting. More than 100 graves were found covered with swastikas and anti-Semitic graffiti at a Jewish cemetery near Strasbourg in eastern France on Tuesday, just hours after similar vandalism in a nearby village. It's just shock. Maurice Dahan, president of the Jewish consistory for the Bas-Rhin region, told AFP, adding that most of the graves were daubed with swastikas. The government's regional authorities said it was investigating the damage to 107 graves at the cemetery in Westhofen, around 25 kilometers west of Strasbourg. About 20 kilometers away, it said that anti-Jewish inscriptions were found in the village of Strafhaus-sur-Zorn. The Alsace region has suffered a rash of racist vandalism over the past year, most notably the desecration of 96 tombs at a cemetery in Quatzenheim in February, which drew nationwide outrage over a spat of anti-Semitic attacks. Emmanuel Macron, during a visit to inspect the damage, vowed to crack down on hate speech, including by an increased focus on educating against racism in schools. That's going to do absolutely nothing. My lord. The rising number of anti-Jewish offenses reported to police, up 74% in 2018 from the previous year, have caused alarm in the country that is home to both the biggest Jewish and the biggest Muslim communities in Europe. You know, this happened once before in Europe, and we all know what the consequences were. And if you take a look at this next article here, why it's a little bit older, it's from March of this year, but why France is losing the war on anti-Semitism. It's coming from 3 very different sources. It's extremely hard to combat online. In the first weeks of 2019, authorities discovered the 96 desecrated tombs in eastern France with the word Juden, which is Jew, in German, scrawled across a bagel shop in Paris, and swastikas marring a street portrait of former government official and Auschwitz survivor Simon Veil. Holy, that's disgusting. On February 16th in Paris, a group of protesters in the Yellow Vest movement cornered local Jewish intellectual Alan Finkielkraut and said, "Dirty Zionist, you're going to die," they yelled, along with "Go home to Israel and France is ours." What? This is supposed to be, the Yellow Vests are supposed to be a pro-democracy movement. And I know all movements have dirty elements in them. There are always nasty people. But this goes beyond nasty. A local intellectual gets cornered and racial slurs thrown at him for his religious beliefs? Last year, France saw a 74% jump in anti-Semitic incidents. A survey from the EU released in December found that a staggering 95% of Jewish French individuals saw anti-Semitism as either a fairly significant or very big problem, more than any other country in the EU. Within days of the Finkielkraut harassment, Emmanuel Macron proposed a controversial new strategy to fight anti-Semitism, including broadening its legal definition, dissolving several far-right groups, and putting his support behind a law that would punish online hate speech with fines of up to several million euros. Let's just stop there. Hate speech, because of the vagueness of the term, is a very difficult thing to deal with. It's difficult to come up with concrete laws. It's incumbent on the people, of the citizens of a country, in my opinion, to crack down on the hate and to alienate the hate and put it over in a corner. Because when we ban it like this, it goes underground and it festers and it grows. And no, this is not my support for any sort of anti-Semitism at all. No. I agree with the broadening of its legal definition. I think that dissolving far-right, if they are actually far-right groups, is a good thing. However, we need to take a look at the far left at the same time, because anti-Semitism is rising very fast on the left. And the putting his support behind a law that would punish online hate speech with fines of up to several million euros. I understand the logic behind that. I'm not sure I agree with it. However, again, I acknowledge the difficulty of the situation when it comes to that subject. France has the largest Jewish population in Europe and the third largest in the world. Anti-Semitism in the country springs not only from fringe online groups, but also from a long history of Jewish persecution and a contemporary anti-establishment surge. Today, Jewish historians and advocacy groups say the far left, the far right, and radical Muslim groups with few shared interests historically are finding common ground in anti-Semitism in the gilets jaunes. Excuse my butchering. And as they do so, the language of anti-Semitism is shifting, making it particularly hard to track and filter as new laws would demand. As old wine in new bottles, Deborah Lipstadt, a professor of Jewish history who famously won a legal battle against Holocaust denial in the 90s, it's the same anti-Semitism, but it morphs into different forms, different expressions, different manifestations. That's an understatement. Old-school French anti-Semitism has been historically associated with conservative, often Catholic factions moving farther right over time. This is the anti-Semitism of the Dreistraffer, starting in 1894, in which a Jewish army captain was wrongly convicted of espionage and spent 5 years on a prison island. The anti-Semitism of the Vichy region and the anti-Semitism of the 20th century far-right leaders like Jean-Marie Le Pen. Recently, new strains have appeared in France, notably from the far left and from France's large Muslim community, where anti-Israel sentiment has morphed into anti-Semitism. Excuse me again. I think this is an understatement. I believe that anti-Israel and anti-Semitism have now become linked. There is no intellectual honesty when it comes to, well, very little when it comes to Israel. People are unable to, if they really dislike Israel, they're unable to see why Israel is so defensive, why they're backed in such a corner. 6 guns pointed at you, what are you going to do? And people who are so pro-Israel that they call any sort of criticism of Israel hate. Israel is a nation that, like any other nation, is open to criticism, and that anti-Semitism and anti-Israel do not have to be linked. But today, they are linked, unfortunately. And it's very, very sad to see, because it hurts everything. It hurts the Jewish population. It hurts any sort of legitimacy to credible criticism that you could level at Israel. It hurts any sort of actual wanting to help the Palestinian people that comes from a place of goodwill and not of hate of Israel. It hurts all of these things. And it's very unfortunate to see. Lipstadt, along with others on the ground in France, is quick to point out that most Muslims are not anti-Semites, and that the growing presence of anti-Semitic fundamentalists does not negate the issue of anti-Muslim prejudice in France or legitimate objections to Israel's policies. Exactly what I just said. The shift is rather about a small but loud faction of people who conflate Israel's policies with Jews everywhere. The far right and far left in particular, with some buy-in from extremist Muslims, have found common ground in the Yellow Vests, a protest on gas tax that quickly morphed into an all-out anti-establishment movement. As the protesters' numbers have dwindled, those who remain have grown more extreme, although reports of anti-Semitism in the chaotic and heterogeneous movement date back to the beginning of the movement in November 2018. This anti-Semitism has taken the form of anti-Jewish slogans, conspiracy-fueled rants, and the taunting of a Jewish woman on the parish subway in December 2018. The group was also slow to make a statement on the Finkelkraut incident. When a response did come, prominent social media figures of the Yellow Vests insisted that the media outcry was a ploy to distract from their crusade. I know this is a bit longer of a video. I apologize, but I believe this is very important. The bill Emmanuel Macron has proposed, written by the deputy of his party, aims to make specifically online hate speech a priority. It would force social media platforms like YouTube and Twitter to remove hate speech in a set time period or risk a fine. Macron has previously advocated for a statute that would make it easier for the government to remove anonymity protections online in order to prosecute individuals who engage in hate speech. The plan has found support among the Jewish community, including the Jewish umbrella organization known as the CRIF and the Jewish Student Union. Social networks are one of the main vectors of anti-Semitic hate and hate in general, because it's also racist hatred of Muslims, hatred of LGBT people. Francis Califat, president of CRIF, told me, "Freedom of expression is something that we all cherish, but it must have limits." Given the laxness of the social media sites when it comes to hate speech online, some experts have questioned whether such a plan would be effective. Others criticize the proposed law as a draconian and infringement on free speech. The intentions are noble, but the venture is perilous and could create a new victim, the internet. And while the law has been pitched to the public as a response to the most recent incidents, the uptick in anti-Semitic hate speech and violence predates the Yellow Vests, pointing to a more complicated and subversive source of hate speech, one hard to fight with laws such as this one. Much of the trouble in fighting online anti-Semitism stems from the shift in rhetoric to what some scholars call soft anti-Semitism or new anti-Semitism. So, a French comedian has been convicted multiple times for inciting hatred against the Jewish population, has become a prime example of this type of behavior. The comedian, as he is known, started out in the early 2000s as a far-left political activist, but is now increasingly associated with the fringes of the far right. He substitutes the word Zionist for Jew, saying things like, Zionism killed Christ. Oh, man. What? He also invented the quenelle salute, a gesture where people grasp their soldier with one hand and point the other straight to the ground. Many have categorized it as a combination of a French gesture meaning up yours and the Nazi salute, with people performing it outside the Auschwitz and French synagogues. Jean-Marie Le Pen, the Nationalist Front Party founder who has been convicted for Holocaust denial multiple times, is a friend and godfather to this comedian's daughter. So I'm going to stop it there because I'm actually getting disgusted as I read this that somebody could ever say something like Zionism killed Christ. That's disgusting. People substituting the word Zionism for Jewish or Jew, disgusting. I really believed that we were done with this idea of religious freedom. That all religions can be criticized, but when you hate on them, that goes too far. When you categorize full groups of people for their religious beliefs and throw slanders and throw slogans and throw rhetoric that has no basis in reality. I myself have encountered this a few times recently on Facebook and in real life. And I think that the rise in anti-Semitism around the world is an increasing problem and threat that we must deal with before it becomes too late. And we know what happens when it gets too late. Let's not let it get there. Thank you so much for watching. Have a nice day. I'm Daniel's Inferno.